Hi everybody, this is Miss Huval. Today's video is for English 3 AP. We are today discussing the rhetorical analysis prompt from the test in 2017. So before you watch this video, you need to go to my website and you need to locate the 2017 AP Rhetorical Analysis Prompt and print it out. You then need to read it, looking for purpose and for rhetorical device. And let me tell you, on this one, you need to make sure that you read the top part carefully. It looks like this. This is mine with notes all over it. But this section right here, read that carefully. They throw in you a slight curveball on this particular passage, so make sure you read that carefully. Also, before you read it, take a look at this. You can access this on my website in PDF format with all of my notes on it in blue. It would be great to print this out and have it. This is the sort of the same thing I gave you for Gatsby, but that was about fiction. But on the AP exam, you're going to have a passage like this that's nonfiction. So this is the cone for nonfiction. These are all the rhetorical devices that you have to choose from when you're reading your passage and thinking what's jumping out at me. And sometimes it's nice to have this in front of you. The ones at the very end over here is purpose. These columns would be good for main rhetorical devices. These would be good for nesting devices. Now that's not a hard and fast rule, but just a general guideline. Okay? So come back to me when you have read this particular passage by Claire Booth Luce. The mouthful, her name. She was speaking in 1960 to the Women's National Press Club. So once you've read it and analyzed it, come back to me. All right. At this point, I'm assuming that you've read the passage and you've given it some thought, that certain things have started jumping out at you that you can put your finger on. But let's start, as you always should, with the rhetorical diamond. That is when we analyze who the author is, what the purpose is, who the audience is, and in what context this information is being presented. Okay? Now, on this one, we look at the top, this little section right here, and we say it's the opening to a speech. It's not the speech, it's the opening of a speech made in 1960 by American journalist Claire Booth Luce. So I've got her at the top, Claire B. Luce, okay? She is a journalist and a politician. That's very important to note. She's speaking to journalists at the Women's National Press Club. So that's our audience. Mostly going to be women, we're assuming, at the Women's National Press Club. So they're all journalists as well. In this speech, Luce went on to criticize the tendency of the American press to sacrifice journalistic integrity in favor of the perceived public demand for sensationalist stories. So that's what the speech as a whole does. It criticizes American journalists for pandering to the public's desire for sensational stories as opposed to what's really important, what the truth is, what needs to be said. Okay, so that's what the overall speech was about. Then she says this. Then the AP people say this. Read the passage carefully. Then, in a well-developed essay, analyze how Luce uses this introduction to prepare her audience for her message. Support your analysis of her rhetoric with specific references to the text. All right, so we know it's a rhetorical analysis. That means we're going to have to figure out what her purpose is. So it tells you flat out the purpose here, but you have to avoid being confused between the purpose of the overall speech and the purpose of this section, this introduction of the speech. The overall speech is a criticism of American journalism, specifically that they're too sensationalized, I guess that makes sense, and that they ought to be focused on more important things than sensational things. However, the introduction, she says, why do I keep saying that? The introduction, the AP packet tells you, is that she's using this introduction to prepare them to hear her message. Okay? So that's our purpose. She's preparing her audience to hear the criticism of journalism. Okay? Now that's two different things. So you got to keep that straight in your brain. All right, so once you figure all that out, the fact that the audience is mostly women is going to be important. The fact that they're about to hear a speech that is critical is important. And what is she specifically doing in this introduction to sort of prepare them to know that they're going to hear difficult things that are critical of them personally and probably as a profession as a whole. All right, so what is she doing? As you were reading, my guess is a few things popped out. She really goes to long lengths to say to this group, look, I'm going to tell you some difficult things, but you're the one that called me to come up here and talk. So you kind of asked for it. I think she even says that word for word on line 25. She says, you asked for it. I didn't volunteer this. You called me up and asked me to come speak about this. So she's kind of in a humorous, light way saying, hey, you might be about to hear something you don't like, but remember, it wasn't my idea to come tell you all about this. It was your idea for me to come tell you all about this. So that probably jumped out at you. The fact that she's a journalist speaking to journalists probably jumped out at you. Now, this lady doesn't use a lot of flowery language. So imagery is going to be a hard sell. She doesn't use a lot of metaphors. She doesn't have personification. She doesn't have a lot of figurative language at all. That's one thing that generally really jumps out at us. You might have also noticed she uses a lot of opposites. A lot of opposites. Now we call that antithesis. She uses opposites in the first paragraph. It's exciting and challenging. She's less happy than you might think and more challenged. So less and more, exciting and challenged. Infinite possibilities and infinite perils. All of those are opposites that she uses in paragraph 1. There are more examples of antithesis. If you look at 44, exacting and inexact. Okay? She's talking about how you pursue the truth. It's not an exact science, but it is an exact science. And she uses this antithesis, I think to emphasize what a tough spot she's been put in. Okay? So she's sort of criticizing herself and at the same time criticizing them because she herself is a journalist and she's been called to deliver a speech that's critical. Okay? So antithesis probably jumped out at you a little bit. Now, the way she builds up her argument here, that kind of relates directly to her tone. So her tone, that might have been something that you noticed as well. She kind of is buttering them up a little bit, it seems. Kind of preparing them to hear this. She kind of says a few flattering things to them. She says at the very end, her last statement that she makes in line 59 and 60, she says, it is far and away the best press in the world. The United States press is far and away the best press in the world. That's a little bit flattery, right? So she uses a lot of things like that to make her tone sort of flattering them. Another thing she says is that they wouldn't be the kind of people who would like to be flattered or buttered up. She said there is, look at line 18, there is no audience anywhere who should be more bored, indeed more revolted by a speaker who tried to fawn on it, butter it up, exaggerate its virtues, play down its faults, and who would more quickly see through any attempt to do so. I ask you only to remember that I'm not a volunteer for this subject tonight. You asked for it. So in essence, that's a little bit of verbal irony right there too, because she's saying, I know if I tried to butter you up, you would see right through me, but at the same time, she really is trying to butter them up a little bit. So that probably jumped out at you, her tone, and the way she was being kind of funny and lighthearted about it. But then she also seemed pretty sincere too. Where she kind of turns really sincere is when she starts talking about what good journalism is. If you look at line 26, she asks a rhetorical question. For what is good journalism all about? And then she lists 3 examples of what journalism ought to do. To illuminate candor and strip away cant. In other words, to shine a light on when people are being honest and when they're being dishonest or evasive, to trying to strip all that away and figure out what they're really saying. She says that journalism is the effort to explain everything in line 34. Actually, that's 33. And it's also in 36 to describe the lives of men. So she gives examples, which is a rhetorical device, of what good journalism ought to do. And then she boils it all down to say that good journalism is the pursuit of and the effort to state the truth. And that word is big. It's powerful. She even calls it the big word, okay? So that's some pretty important word choice there. That probably stuck out in your brain. Word choice, the big word, and then the word truth is a loaded word. It has a very powerful connotation. So as you see, as you're reading through these things, the things that she's put in there for emphasis, the things that she's trying to do, usually jump out at you. You just got to learn how to put a rhetorical device with what she's doing. Okay? Now, so I've thrown a bunch of those out at you. There was an allusion in there to a guy named Billy Graham and a guy named Fulton John Sheen. Okay, so there were allusions there that factor into this big analogy. She uses an analogy to explain the position that she's in to the position that these famous preachers and priests are in. Getting up in front of a group of people and telling them what they're doing wrong. Okay, so a preacher gets up and points out that there's sin and points out that bad things are happening and teaches you how to walk the straight and narrow path. That's kind of what she's doing too. So there's this analogy where she compares herself to a preacher, and then she alludes to these two, I'm sure in 1960, were very well known. Everyone would have known their name and been familiar with their work at that time. So all of these are rhetorical devices that we can weave into our paragraphs. The question is, what are the main ones that we ought to be talking about? So, in a rhetorical analysis essay, we're going to have 4 paragraphs. Introduction, 2 bodies, and a conclusion. And in the course of our 2-body paragraphs, we need 4 plus rhetorical devices. Now, the way we're going to achieve that is that each of our body paragraphs will be on one major rhetorical device. And when I say major, I'm talking about something from this category, maybe that category. All right? Then the other 2 rhetorical devices, so that'll give you 2, 1 for each main body paragraph. The other rhetorical devices are going to be smaller ones that we nest inside of these paragraphs. All right? So, in this particular piece of nonfiction, what could we write about for our 2 main paragraphs? Well, when I was reading it, I saw 3 possible options. Okay, now you only need 2 body paragraphs, right? Right. But I can see three different ones you could use. Okay, and so if you were going to write this, you would just pick 2 of those 3 because you don't need 3 body paragraphs. I don't think you got time to write 3 body paragraphs in the 45 minutes that you'll be given. Okay, so I thought the 3 that jumped out at me, 3 big ones that could be used. Tone, ethos, and logos. Okay, So I think ethos is probably the strongest one. So let me show you what I was thinking for ethos. All right. So ethos, as you know, means the credibility of the speaker. Okay. Not if she's making a moral argument, but her personal credibility. All right. So what does Claire Booth Luce do to convince you that she knows what she's talking about? That she's credible, that she's unbiased, that she's sincere, that she's not a jerk, that she's not offensive. You know, these are all the things that ethos has to have. All right? So, first of all, she is a journalist. Okay? That needs to be mentioned. That could be your supporting idea number one. And as a journalist, she is on the inside, so she knows the profession inside and out and is qualified to comment upon it. That's important. Next, you could say that she's unbiased. She's going to tell the good and the bad. You asked for it, line 25. She's humble and sincere. In line 45 to 49, she says, consequently, no audience is more forgiving, I hope, to the speaker who fails or stumbles in his own pursuit of the truth. The only failure that this audience could never excuse in any speaker would be the failure, to try to tell the truth as he sees it about his subject. Okay? That makes her seem humble and sincere. I may not do this perfectly, but I'm going to try my best. All right? So, some nesting devices that you could use in a paragraph about ethos. The antithesis. We talked about that in paragraph 1. How does the antithesis impact her credibility? Well, it emphasizes, these opposites emphasize, it's exciting and it's challenging. There are infinite possibilities and infinite perils. She uses those opposites to show what a tough spot she's actually in trying to deliver this message. Okay? So that would be an excellent one to nest because it relates to her credibility. Okay? Another one is you could use the allusion to Billy Graham and Archbishop Fulton Sheen. Tell the people of their sins, that's a hard job. So bear with me as I do this. That adds to her credibility as well. Now, I mentioned Billy Graham and Bishop Sheen a few times up here. Now, in your essay, you could only mention them one time. You can't double dip. You've got to use each example one time, and you can't repeat. So this could make a beautiful body paragraph right here on ethos. You could also do one on tone, the tone being sort of a flattering tone. We talked about being the best press in the world from line 58 to 60. You'd never forgive me for not telling the truth, line 45 to line 50. Of course, if you use that here, you wouldn't be able to use it here because that would be double dipping. Lines 20 to 22, you'd hate flattery, and we talked about how that was verbal irony. Okay? So that would be a good thing to do. You could nest verbal irony under the flattering tone. What else could you talk about with tone? The big word choice, diction, connotation of truth. How do these two things add into the flattering process? Well, you're the kind of people who want to hear the truth. Okay? You're the kind of people who understand that truth is a big word. The import of this will register with you because you're a journalist. Okay? Buttering them up, preparing them to hear the bad things that she's got to say. All right? So I think tone could be a good paragraph. The other thing you might want to do is logos as a paragraph. Logos, of course, is your evidence. Okay? And here, with her evidence, she's trying to prove that it is important for journalists to take a hard look at their profession. Okay? That's what she's trying to establish with all of the different things that she's saying. It's important for us to do this. All right? How does she get that across? Well, she uses examples of what journalism should be. Okay? Lines 28 to 36. It should illuminate candor and strip cant. Explain events and describe lives. So she gives those Examples, that's evidence that she uses to prove that it's important to take a hard look at. These are the lofty goals that we aspire to, and it's important for us to evaluate from time to time of whether or not we're hitting those goals. All right? You could use, you got the rhetorical question that you could nest under example. Or you could use the analogy. Her situation is like the situation of Billy Graham and Archbishop Fulton Sheen. Okay? Now, you couldn't use this if you had used it in a tone paragraph or if you had used it in an ethos paragraph. But if you hadn't, that would be a good one. How does the analogy fit in as evidence? It's another way of showing that she's about to get up like a preacher does and tell you what you're doing wrong. And it's a tough spot to be in, but it's something that they've asked her to do. And it's important for journalism to be good journalism, to do that from time to time, to shine that light on it. All right? Now, you could nest under examples also imagery. It's got a really kind of interesting way when she talks about the goals of journalism, of making it seem, it's the most, I would say, the most creatively written section. She's got this image of the moon coming over the horizon, and she talks about when you describe people, describe men and women, she says, close at hand or thousands of miles away, familiar in their behavior or unfamiliar in their idiosyncrasies. And that's kind of an interesting image, that the goal of journalism is to look out across the country, across the world, and to be able to look at people and describe in detail what they're all about for people who can't meet them themselves. You see how that's kind of an image? You create that image as a journalist, and that's a goal of journalism. All right? So I think these would be great body paragraphs. Maybe something else jumped out at you. I would like for you to make yourself a little outline, give yourself 45 minutes, and try to write a draft of an essay. Go ahead and email it to me. And if you have different rhetorical devices than I came up with, that is 100% fine. These are not the only ones that are there. Those are the ones that jumped out at me. Those are the ones I chose to weave into these ideas for these paragraphs. So go ahead and try to do that. Email it to me, and as quick as I can, I'll read it and provide feedback for you. Okay, I'm glad you came to listen to me today. Thanks.